There is a relatively new material in the art market available to us these days that isn't quite getting as much notoriety as it should be getting, because this material is surprisingly incredibly useful. Welcome to another portrait painting tutorial. The best new material. This is the original reference that we will be using from Cobra. We will begin with a simple charcoal sketch. And of course, charcoal is not the new material that we're talking about. Neither is cotton canvas, which is what we're using. And in fact, it is not a particular size that I'm working on. It is in fact just a sheet of cotton that I cut off of my cotton canvas roll. And charcoal that I'm using is willow charcoal. But at this point, you probably already know what the new material is, and it's not that new, but it's relatively new considering oil painting is like one of the oldest art forms. Painting is just one of the oldest art forms in history, in human history. I mean, come on, ever since the cave paintings. That's like, yeah, that's a long time. So, water mixable oil paint will be the material that I will be using once we get into paint. Now, the important thing to note is that if you can draw out a basic block-in of a head with charcoal, it helps tremendously when you use water mixable oil paint or when you transition into it. It is a different material in its handling when it comes to drawing with the paint, and I'll get more into that as we go along. Now, in terms of the technique involved in the drawing, for those of you that may not have seen my previous videos, the simple idea is to get the proportions as correct as possible, knowing that they're not going to be 100% accurate, but they're going to be accurate enough to correct in the painting process. So you don't need to stress out entirely over the accuracy of your drawing at this stage. If anything, it should be the most fun thing in the world to you, especially if you're just getting started with drawing and painting. I'm looking at relative angles to one another. As you see there, we have these simple shapes for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And they are simple in the sense that I can move them around easily. The eye is composed of no more than maybe 3 or 4 angles. The nose is basically a triangle with another triangle on the bottom representing the shadow. And the same thing with the mouth. These are the basic shapes that I sometimes refer to as stand-ins, because they're standing in for where the true shapes will eventually live. So the cast shadow and the form shadow have been indicated just by simple lines underneath. Now, the trick here is that this is a preliminary sketch for a portrait painting. So you can't get attached to the lines, you can't get attached to the aesthetic of what the drawing looks like. And in fact, you can use this method with traditional oil paints as well. With traditional oil paints, you are able to draw with just thin paint. So the palette consists of just simple colors that will be listed in the description box of the video, but I'm basically just using burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and whatever was already on my palette there, thinned out with water. So to get the light and dark shapes, this is where things are going to be very important for you to pay attention to the differences between water mixable oil paints, and in particular I'm talking about Cobra. Cobra Talon's water mixable oil paints. I'm not talking about any other brand of water mixable, though I'm sure they would handle somewhat similar. Now, The difference here is that the water mixable oil paint, the Cobra Talon's water mixable oil paint, when you thin it out with water, it starts to settle into the canvas. It basically pretends to dry. It starts to settle into the canvas. And at this point in the demonstration, I was actually on Zoom with my students while beginning this phase of the painting. And I have done many paintings already with Cobra Talons, but I did them in different style, basically starting out with color right away. So I didn't notice this phenomenon because I didn't use water in the beginning. I actually just used traditional linseed oil with Cobra Talons, and that's how I painted for a while until I decided to experiment with just using water and trying out this technique. So what happens is, like I said, the paint pretends to dry. So you'll actually be able to run your finger across the oil paint that you just thinned out and applied to the canvas after maybe like 5 or 10 minutes, and it will act as though it is touch dry. And there we see my luxurious palette that is super duper expensive. It is incredibly expensive palette, as you can tell, especially with the crack down the middle of it. I'm just messing with you. So it is just a piece of Tupperware, the container of a Tupperware, which actually is pretty convenient because I can put it in the freezer. And there it is. See how I was pointing my finger? I started to notice this, and it's not the first time that I noticed this happen. Actually, when I first noticed that water mixable oil paints did that, I was kind of upset because I was so set in my ways, used to how the traditional handles, because no one had ever taught me how to use these or shown me what use they could have. In fact, in the past, when I did this, I didn't even know that I could dry brush, which is essentially what I'm doing here. Do you see that brush there? See how it's running across that line and nothing came off? That's pretty magical. So I'm able to dry brush over top of a line with oil paint that I just applied literally minutes ago. And that is incredibly useful, and I'm going to tell you why. It's incredibly useful because if you mark down your proportions like I did with the thin dark paint, well, they're going to be there and they're not going to come off anymore because they just don't come off as easily. Now, if I were to apply water to it or pressure, yeah, sure, they come off, but the fact that I can dry brush over them without them coming off when I'm applying the light and darks is it is incredibly useful in the sense that this new material has the rapid settling nature of acrylic, but it has the subtle, say, blending factors that oil paint has. It is an incredibly useful thing, especially in the start of a painting. Now, when you get down to the middle stages where you're building form and developing form, there's yet another phenomenon that I have figured out with water mixable oil paint, in particular Cobra Talon's water mixable oil paint. But I'm curious to try out other ones now. Just because in the beginning, when I started using these, I was so against water mixable. I used them because I thought that you wanted me to show you how to use them and tell you how great they were, but I was so used to my ways in the past that it was quite difficult for me to adapt to them. And I've been using water mixable oil paints ever since I moved into my new apartment, which was in December. Now the video is in. See how that doesn't come off? Yeah, that is incredible. The fact that it just doesn't come off. Now, in terms of the technique, this is important for me to tell you. For classical painting, any type of realist painting, if you can solve the problems of your big proportions as early as humanly possible, then you can transition with a lot of confidence into this stage. And that stage is the first color. Now, obviously, we used color before, but we used it in kind of like in a monochromatic sense. So, in theory, we did create an underpainting, but in practice, it is an active underpainting, which is sometimes referred to as open, because we left the lights open. The traditional word is grisaille, which stands for the word gray, but some of us may refer to this as an open grisaille. And from time to time, I will be pointing at the painting as if I'm talking, because I was actually talking to my students when I started filming this. I was filming this exactly a week ago with my students. So the skin color, the first skin color that we're going to add is going to be thin. We're going to thin out the paint, but first I'm covering the forehead. Now, as you see there, it's just going to be flat. So basically I'm killing off the white of the canvas, and I thinned out the paint for a particular reason. Now, it's not thin like a watercolor at all. It's not thin like, it's not, as you see, it's not falling off the paper on the face, but it is falling off the paper down below. Now, let me tell you the reasoning for that. On the bottom of the painting, the skin tone will not receive that many layers, but the face will receive multiple layers. That's important to note. Now, the colors are not complicated. Let me tell you, now that we're mixing up a string of colors. Now, this video is not particularly about how to mix color, but the color is rather simple. It's white, orange, a little bit of yellow, and some gray, and that gets you the basic skin tone that you're looking at here. Now, the palette, for those of you wondering, is titanium white, primary yellow, primary orange, pyrrole red, burnt umber, ultramarine blue. So that is titanium white, primary yellow, primary orange, pyrrole red, burnt umber, ultramarine blue. Now, the white, the primary orange on their own can create a skin color. If you add a little bit of ultramarine blue, it will neutralize the orange, which will create a type of gray, and that will give you your orangey warm skin color. Now, in order to add some red to it, you just add pyrrole red. Now, all of these colors that I'm using, all of the Cobra Talons colors, they dry at the same rate, which is different with in comparison to traditional oil paints. So the predictability of how certain areas in the painting will dry is that problem is solved, because when you're using traditional, your umbers are going to dry faster, your reds are going to dry more slowly unless they're cadmiums. And then there's the thing about cadmiums. So lots of things to talk about. Now let's focus on the painting. So what we're doing now that we covered the skin color, we killed off the white. We're going in yet again with thin paint, and we're finally delineating the boundaries of each form on the eye. So we have the upper eyelid, we have the tear duct, we have the pupil, we have the iris, and now we have pretty much just ultramarine blue, white neutralized with some of the skin color that we see here. And we're starting to window shade, which is sometimes a derogatory term, but I don't think of it as a derogatory term. Just think of a small window in a painting. So you're shading in a small window at a time. And I don't always paint like this. I paint like this if, for example, I don't have a long time to work on the painting, so I don't want the entire face to be covered with big planes and then I just leave it that way. And if I'm trying to work more realistic, because with this painting I did intend to make it more realistic than I usually prefer to paint, then I use this approach, which is the same with any media. If you're using acrylic, watercolor, pastel, traditional oil paint, water mixable oil paint, I would do the same thing if I was drawing with a pencil. I would do this if I'm trying to get a more realistic result. What I'm going to do is create a bit of an example, something for the other parts of the painting to be to basically look up to. So if you think about it as a team, this is like teamwork, right? So you have two eyes, an ear, a nose, cheek. You have cheekbone and a jaw, a chin, and that's pretty much it. So these are all like individual members of a team, and the eye is going to be the leader of the team. So the eye is going to set the bar. It's going to set an example for what the other features can be like. Now, remember in the beginning when I said that get the drawing as close as possible, but don't stress out over it because you're going to be making changes during the painting. And this is where the changes can happen now. As we start to put in more information into the eye, more shapes into the eye, more planes, we see that the nose, the eyes, the other eye, the mouth, the ear is still in line form. So I'm able to easily push a line left, right, up, down, anywhere relative to the eye. So everything now is anchored down relative to the eye, in particular the tear duct. It is an excellent place on the drawing to be able to move things relative to one another. And there I'm just using the back end of a brush with a little bit of white and blue, back end of the brush. And that would be no different than if I were using traditional oil paint. I like to use the back end of the brush as sort of a super tiny brush where I can get brush strokes down that are impossible to do with my the size brushes that I have. So in terms of the brushes, if you're curious about the differences between traditional oil paint brushes and water mixable oil paint brushes, there are none. I'm using, and I repeat, there are no differences. I'm using sable brushes for the small shapes, and I'm using bristle brushes for the big shapes. Sable brushes have the, like this one that I'm using here, which is a cat's tongue shape sable brush, pure red sable. It has the ability to hold a lot of paint, yet still apply a really fine mark down, a fine brush stroke. So it's soft, yet it can hold a lot of paint. Different than synthetics. Synthetics are soft, but they can't hold as much paint as a sable brush. So it gives you more control over the painting process. So now that we have put the eye down, we added the light and shadow, the middle tones, the dark lights, the accents, all the form involved in making it look 3D. Now you see here, I'm going in with the background color and I am chopping the nose in towards the eye. So yes, I'm making a drawing correction with the background color, which allows me to move through the painting process that much faster. Efficiency is quite important when it comes to painting. However, when I was in school, I would always be told that better is faster from my student, not my student, I was a student to a lot of different teachers. And they would basically tell me better is faster. So I wasn't rushing anything in the beginning, but I knew in the back of my mind that there would be some things that are not quite as accurate until I get to a stage like this. So, talking about realistic painting now, it is important for you to understand that the camera is at an angle with relation to the painting, which tells you something very important. Now, those of you that have been watching the videos for a while know what I'm about to say, but it is quite important for me to say it. And the important thing is that your painting is at a 90-degree angle relative to you, and the canvas or panel or whatever it is that you're working on is at eye level or close to it. You see that the painting is pretty much at eye level for me, perhaps a little bit lower than eye level, but relatively close to eye level. So keep it that way. And if you do, it is impossible to have a camera dead center on the canvas when you are painting. But bear in mind that having the painting at a 90-degree angle is the same with any material. It's the same with any drawing. Whatever the media is, it is important to do that. So now we blocked in a simple triangle of dark underneath of the nose. Never put a rectangle underneath of the nose for obvious reasons, but a triangle, if you know what I mean, a triangle is more fitting of the of anything that would exist underneath of a nose. Now, what we're doing is as soon as we put that triangle in, we're chopping into it with the skin color. It is a little bit more pink, so your combinations would be a little bit more of the cadmium orange white with a little more of the pyrrole red. Pyrrole red is a synthetic color. It is similar to cadmium red light on its own, but it is more transparent than any cadmium would be. Now, as we continue to chop in the shapes of the nose, now is an important part for me to tell you something quite useful about the Cobra Talons paints, and that is probably, and I'm going to say this with some doubt, it could be that the other water mixables are similar, but I just haven't, in current times, I haven't really experimented with the other ones. I just remember, based on my history, Cobra was the best one. But as you continue to paint wet on wet paint, which is referred to as alla prima, see, I wouldn't think of this as an alla prima painting in terms of painting it all in one day. This took many days. In fact, the nose, as you're seeing this here, is a whole different day. This is a whole nother day in the painting process. That's how meticulous I was with the eye, with the other eye, with the forehead. Very meticulous. Now, the thing to mention is that the water mixable oil paints don't sink in as much as the traditional oil paints. And I hypothesize that must have something to do with the modified linseed oil, which is the heart of what water mixable oil paint is. It is the same pigment that you would get out of traditional oil paint, but it has a modified linseed oil, which allows it to thin with water. Now, I apologize for the camera. I forgot to adjust the focus on the mouth there. But in any case, it is an interesting thing that the Cobra does not sink in. And those of you that are not familiar with what sinking in is when your painting dries and the dark areas start to become gray looking. They start to become lighter and they start to become gray looking. And in the past, you see how I'm adding a little bit of yellow there to the blue? That's making it kind of greenish. I actually made that a little too green, and now you see that I'm correcting it with orange, which is giving me kind of a greenish brown. A lot of times I would get like SOS, um, like, please save me, something is going wrong with my painting. My darks all of a sudden are starting to look light and gray. Did my painting break down? Did an alien show up from another planet and ruin my painting? And the answer is no. It didn't. An alien didn't show up from the sky and from space and mess with your painting when you were asleep. That's just what happens with traditional oil paint. See, what happens is the oil is absorbed by the layer underneath, and not just a layer of oil paint, but it could be the gesso that you have underneath is absorbing the oil. And now I hypothesized that the modified linseed oil uh, is absorbed obviously by the layer underneath, but as it is absorbed by the layer underneath, it doesn't turn gray. It just stays the same, and it must have something to do with the chemistry. Now, in terms of the painting, how does that affect the painting? It makes your life a lot easier because you don't need to oil out anymore. So in between layers, you don't need to apply medium. And now you're going to ask me, what medium am I using? And the answer is none. The paint already has medium built into it, which is the modified linseed oil. And as we start to add these colors down, this is going to be the light and shadow turning in towards the cheekbone and over towards the closer to the eye. Now, because the model is a young model, the form for the cheekbones is going to be more round, kind of puff like. It's going to be quite just quite round, like a pillow, not like a brick, but like a pillow. Um, so it's going to require a lot of gradations of values. And I'm throwing a lot of terms at you, but more so I'm focusing on the technique involved with the water mixable. So now the fact that it doesn't sink in is quite remarkable that it doesn't sink in. And you see how I'm rubbing my hand on that? That means it's already touch dry, which is quite useful. Now, fat over lean is a question that you're going to ask. How can you maintain fat over lean with your painting if you apply multiple layers like this? And the answer is, if you keep your ratio of medium to paint consistent, then you don't need to worry about fat over lean. Now, this is going to be an interesting thing to look at, and that's going to be making corrections or just editing your painting. As you saw there, I painted out the ear a little bit, but you can actually see the ghost of the ear underneath, which is remarkable because it's only been a couple days in between these layers. In fact, I think it was just a day. I think it was. It was a day between the layers, and it was already dry enough for me to paint over it with thin paint and move the ear. I'm actually moving it to the right relative to us, which is going to make the face a little bit wider. And now, because the camera is at an angle, it's going to make it look even more narrow, but it's not as narrow as it seems there. But to me, it was still too narrow, so I moved the ear. So remember, I said that the eye, the model's left eye was going to be our anchor, and we move everything relative to it. And you see that I'm laying down thin paint to make the correction, and I can just go right into color, and you'll see me do that. I'll go right into color in order to place down the ear. I won't need to use much outlines for it anymore. So I know most of you are going to ask me, so how can you keep your layers of oil to pigment, meaning fat over lean? Well, how can you maintain that while still just using water and water mixable oil paint? Um, and the answer is in the way that the paint dries. So the way that the paint dries is through oxidization, just like traditional oil paints. So what it is the paint dries when the when oxygen interacts with the modified linseed oil, which is the same as traditional linseed oil. And as you saw there, I used a horizontal line to compare the nose, where the nose falls on a horizontal relative to the ear. So, like I was saying, if you keep the paint consistent, meaning you just use the paint as it is, you are not going to run into any trouble with fat over lean simply because the paint is going to dry consistently because you're not changing it in any way. You're just using water and you're using the paint, and you're not changing anything, so you can't violate fat over lean by changing, because nothing changes. It's just going to be the same consistent thing. And that's something that Nelson Shanks, who taught my teachers, would tell students. He would say that over the years he found that if you can keep your materials as simple as possible and as consistent as possible, then you will get the best results, is what he would say. And he would paint with traditional oil paints, obviously, but he would, in his later years, for his medium, he would just use stand oil and turpentine, just turpentine mixed with stand oil, and that was his medium. And in the past, he used to use more exotic mediums, which I'm not even going to get into because they're too complicated for me to get into. But later on, over the years, he found that it was better to keep the materials more consistent. And I have created other paintings, more finished paintings with Cobra, with traditional linseed oil, such as this one. This was done over a couple months using Cobra Talon. And remember, if you're interested in buying the same exact paints that I'm using, please check out the links in the description box of this video. And traditional linseed oil. So I did clean the brushes with mineral spirits and all that. I used the a Cobra because I didn't want to use any lead or any cadmium. Now, the reason I'm not using cadmium or lead is because I live in a one-bedroom apartment now, which I'm actually happy with because it's cheaper than, well, I guess everyone knows how the economy is these days. It's much more livable than you would imagine. The very fact that I don't have lead or I don't have cadmium makes me sleep a little better at night because I do have, as many of you probably know, I do have a new puppy, which he's now 6 months old. And we spend a lot of time together, and he sometimes gets into my paints, like bumps into them and stuff. And it's easy to wash off if it's water mixable oil paints. Uh, so, so yes, you can do more long-term finished paintings with the Cobra, and you wouldn't even notice the difference with the finished painting. And yes, you can varnish it using traditional varnish because it doesn't violate the fact that oil cannot have anything water over top. So you can have oil over top anything with water, and it's fine. So another theory is that because of the way that water evaporates so quickly, um, and maybe it doesn't evaporate as fast as mineral spirits. Who knows? I'm sure you can Google that, but the way that the water evaporates is such that there shouldn't be any moisture trapped within the layer of paint once the paint dries. Because water mixable oil paint, just like any paint really, when it dries, it forms sort of a layer of plastic. So you don't need to worry about any water molecules being trapped within your layers of paint. Now, I'm not a chemist, so I'm not telling you all this stuff with a PhD background. I'm merely a painter who's been painting for like 14 years or so now, telling you what has worked for me in the past and what's working for me currently in the present. So, with the painting technique right now, as we are going into the shapes, it looks like we've given her a 5 o'clock shadow, but don't be alarmed with that. That's actually easier for me to do. It's easier for me to have dark paint first and then progressively add light to it. It's easier for me to work that way simply because just like traditional oil paint, water mixable oil paint, it's easier to add light, drag light into dark to create gradation. And like I said, I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you, but a gradation is nothing more than values going from light to dark, and values just mean how light or how dark is something. So now we're just going to go back and forth, and we're going to round out the cheek almost like a ball, but it's not a ball because there's planes to it. There's lots of planes involved in it. But we won't get into all the planes involved in it. But what I will tell you is the number one thing I will tell you is, and I tell this to my students all the time, and believe me, once they get this, they improve like overnight, like they're entirely different painters. But the thing to know is that you should never lose the distinction between light and shadow if you are trying to make something look realistic. If you can maintain your light and shadow and put in various different planes in between light and shadow to describe form, you have done something that all of the old masters did. You have learned something that all of the painters before us did to create the masterful works of art that they created. And it's just simply not being emphasized enough, especially now in the time. Now I'm not going to go on a rant, but during these times, it is a lot. It's very difficult to hold people's attention for a long period of time. So, if you are still watching this video at 38 minutes and 4 seconds, comment something down below. I am a learner. Comment, I am a learner. I intend to learn. Or anything really, anything learning oriented, because that shows me how interested you are in learning the art of painting. So now we're adding more red to the cheeks. And as we start to add more red to the cheeks, we're introducing a predominant color change that's quite subtle. And the mission here is to make it look as though this painting was glazed carefully, because that's the method that Bouguereau used. And I think now with modern chemistry, you really don't have that much of a need to glaze anymore. And I say this and I might offend some people because I made lots of videos featuring glazing. And if you're wondering what glazing even is, it's kind of like glazing a turkey in a sense that you're just adding something liquidy and transparent to cover something else. So it's a stained glass effect. You're adding a semi-transparent layer of paint over top of dry paint in order to get a stained glass-like effect. So the sunlight would be analogous to the layer underneath, And the stained glass window would be analogous to the semi-transparent layer of paint. That's the method that Bouguereau used to. That's the method Bouguereau was known to use to create the effects that he had. Now I'm here in the future telling you that you don't need it. You don't need to glaze in order to get the effects that I'm showing you here in the painting. Some people call this tiling. Other people call this a mosaic. You can call it whatever you want, but you're just adding opaque paint over top of opaque paint, just like that, in a wet on wet fashion, and you're working with large values in order to create the effect of form, the volume involved in the face. That is with thicker paint now, in order to get soft ghosts, almost like cloud like careful value changes that are analogous to what a glaze would be. You need to paint thicker. You need to paint thicker, and that's why I'm using a bristle brush, which, just like the sable brush, it holds more paint, yet can still make a nice and soft touch, unlike some cheaper brushes that can shovel the paint around. And the palette that I'm using, the limited palette, to me this is a limited palette. The limited palette is easier for me to work with. And why am I working with the Tupperware? I'm working with the Tupperware because I just don't feel like cleaning palettes. It gets on my nerves. So as soon as I'm done, I just put the thing back in the freezer. And I didn't know that the palette was cracked until I started mixing paint. So for my next one, I'll just switch to another Tupperware that's not cracked, and hopefully I won't crack the Tupperware. Um, but like I said, it's just easier to move around, and of course you don't want to put water over top of a wooden pallet. Although I'm sure my pallets would be fine, but you don't want to put water over top of a wooden pallet, and a Tupperware container lid like the one I was using is pretty easy to hold because it's lightweight. So it's somewhat like a handheld palette, but it's easier to store. It's easier to move around, and especially if you mix your colors in gradations, like I do. Like I said, I've used the word gradation a lot, but just like on the face there, the palette has a careful gradation of tones on it to keep organized from light to dark. And so you do this back and forth. You move your planes. Uh, you move your planes around, dark against light, light against dark, and you construct these planes based on the anatomy and the perspective that you know. And you're not so much painting what you see as much, you're painting what you know. And that's more mental than the beginning, which is more kind of intuitive. So you paint the structure that you know into the painting at these subtle stages. Not that this is that subtle yet, but in the subtle stages, it becomes very difficult to see, and it takes a lot of time. I think this is about the. I think this is the fourth day. This might be the third or the fourth day that I worked on this painting, and I think I worked on it about 5 times, 5 different days. Not long days, but probably like an hour here, an hour there, 30 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Um, so not very long days. And you're seeing here how the dark on the left side of the canvas it still hasn't sunken in, and it won't. It really won't. It'll stay like that. And the painting will look carefully glazed, and it will look like it it was done in that way. But like I said, you can get these effects with traditional. You can get these effects with non-traditional. It becomes your choice now. After watching this video, if you want to continue to use traditional, or if you're using acrylic, if you're using acrylic because you don't want to deal with the harmful solvents and the lead and all that stuff, there's no reason for you to use acrylic anymore. Use water mixable, especially if you're trying to create realistic looking paintings. There is no need for you to use acrylic. But if you want me to make some videos on acrylic, if you want me to, I can figure that out. But for the most part, I have the same concerns that many of you had years ago with the risk factor with oil paint. And I'll tell you, there's really not much risk anymore. You don't have any lead, you don't have any mineral spirits, you don't have any cadmiums, you don't have various mediums that you need to concern yourself with. You don't need to worry about the paint sinking in. You don't need to worry about expensive mediums. You don't need to worry about how difficult it's going to be to clean your brushes and having to buy special soap to clean your brushes. Pretty much just hand soap or dish soap and water, and the paint falls right off. You don't need to worry about the paint taking a long time to dry in order for you to put in the next layer. And you don't need to worry about how expensive the paints are, because Cobra is not very expensive at all. So there's a lot of reasons to use it, especially if you're in an apartment or something, or you have kids that get into everything, or puppies that get into everything. It resolves a lot of issues that especially I've had with traditional oil paint. Now you see we're closing in on the finish with the planes of the face. And now you see it has almost like a glazed like effect. It looks like it was glazed through many layers of paint, but it wasn't. And now we're going to thin out the paint yet again. And like I said, it's so wonderful that these paints, it's so easy to clean these brushes. It gives me a lot of confidence. And like I said, that palette being the way it is, it's so simple to hold and to move around. And so now I'm painting in her hair. I thinned out the paint yet again with full confidence that the paint wasn't going to sink in on me. And we're mixing something red, as you see a lot of pyrrole red, very similar to the skin color, but more red and dark. By skin color, I meant the shadow. And hair should be treated just the same as the face, with planes and light and dark. Just a few last minute details on the ear. And you see how easily these paints layer, and how clean they look, how smooth they are. And that's about it. That is the completed painting for you. It took a couple days to paint it, but hopefully it shows you some new information, things that can be done with water mixable oil paints, and the great advantages to water mixable oil paints. So if you found this video useful to you, if you found it insightful, if you've learned something new, with this video and you would like to take your art education with me further, please consider my online classes, which now start at just $5 a month, allows you to take a Monday morning still life class with me, both on YouTube and Zoom. $10 a month on Wednesday mornings allows you to have the still life and portrait painting classes both on Zoom and on YouTube. And there are many more benefits available on my online classes. And I am so proud of my students. They have learned so much over the years. So once again, I wish you all the very best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.